No, that's good having that. We should do a slide like this when we do our trainings. What a good idea.
Thank you.
Okay, so we are live on YouTube now.
Thank you, Katie.
Webinar is now live. Okay.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us on this very interesting Tuesday morning. I'm going to go ahead and, stop my screen share. If you'll give me just a moment. My Zoom is being strange. I don't see. All right. Katie, can you stop my screen share for me, please? Oh, here we are. Okay. Thank you. So thank you so much, everyone, again, for joining us on this lovely morning, or well, lovely might be a stretch, but on this interesting morning. You'll notice my face is lit from the orange sky that we have here in Salem. But with me today are Louise Dix and Diane Hess from the Fair Housing Council of Oregon. Louise has been working in the Fair Housing Council for 8 years, training hundreds of groups of housing providers, realtors, and advocates in fair housing law and best practice. Diane worked for the Fair Housing Council and education and outreach for nearly 20 years. She's instrumental in starting the FHCO's very successful historical bus tours that I've heard many great things about, and is an experienced trainer in the fair housing industry, as well as aspects of fair housing law. So today they are going to be sharing with us housing discrimination from a historical lens. So with that, I will turn it over to them. If you have any questions, feel free to post them in the chat. We will be processing CE at the end. No need to put your NERDS number or any information into the chat, but questions will be addressed and answered at the very end. So with that, I'll turn it over.
Great. Well, I'm going to do share screen here and get my thing up here. And there we go. Oops, what happened?
You're perfect.
There we go. What happened to, oops, let's go back. So we're going to talk about fair housing from a historical perspective about discrimination in Oregon and how this has impacted our housing industry today. So anyway, how does knowing about our past help us understand our present? There are ghosts, really, of historic discrimination, segregation, and displacement all around us. We were a heavy, heavy area, a state with KKK rallies. This one on the top is Albany back in the 20s. I don't know if many of you are from the Portland area, might remember Portland's Coon Chicken Inn. All these issues from the past help us provide context as we look at current segregation and current issues today that we're experiencing. It gives us a basis. So we're an incredibly white state. Nationally, there's about 13% African Americans, and we only have about 2% here in Oregon. And Portland is actually the whitest major city in the country. What we find are there concentrations of people with the same race or national origin in neighborhoods. And the question is, in many cases, this might be a choice that they make to be closer to people from the same country, from the same origin or whatever. But in many cases, it may not be. So we're going to look at why this is today and why we see this today. So we're going to start back with our native peoples, the indigenous peoples in Oregon. And you'll see the map on the bottom shows where all the various tribes are. For thousands of years, we had more than 60 tribes that flourished here in Oregon. The picture on the top is the Klamath Indian Reservation, or it wasn't a reservation then. By the mid-1800s, more than 80% had perished from epidemics that were brought here from whites, typhus and malaria and smallpox and so on. So we lost actually more than 62 tribes ultimately from all these different things that happened. So let's go to the Oregon Trail. We had the Oregon Land Donation Act in 1850, and it was for whites only, for white males. They were given a 320-acre parcel of land. If they were married, they could get 640 acres, but it really was for whites. Can you imagine the increase in value on those properties that were given free? And again, 1850s conflicts and treaties, and most tribes were forced onto reservations. We were the only state to actually exclude African Americans. It was in our Constitution. There was a debate in the Civil War era over whether we'd enter as a free or slave state. And we did enter as a free state, but it was in our Constitution that African Americans were not permitted to live here. It was in the 1844 and 1849 Oregon Territory laws. If you were found to be here and you were Black, you were given 20 to 39 lashes, stripes, and removed physically from the Oregon Territory. Do you want to talk about Rose Jackson's story, Diane?
Sure. So just to give you an idea of what it was like at that time, the Allen family, when they took the Oregon Trail, when they left from Missouri to Oregon, which took months and of course many thousands of miles, they brought their slave Rose Jackson with them. And since it was illegal for an African American or mixed race person to be in Oregon, she traveled across the country in a wooden box, kind of like a coffin with holes at the top. Now, apparently at night she'd go out to stretch her bones, but it was very clear all around the country that African Americans were not supposed to be here. So there were a few who did come here, like Ms. Jackson, but again, it was very secretive.
Great. So we were admitted as a free state with this exclusion law in our Constitution when we became a state in the United States of America. It was finally repealed in 1926. It wasn't enforced up until all that time, but it was still in our Constitution and finally removed and repealed in 1926. The language was finally removed in 2002. Okay.
And just to add a quick point there, in the Great Migration, where so many African Americans left the South for the North in the 19th century through the 20th century, word was out, don't go to Oregon. It is not welcoming, which was one of the reasons that Oregon was remaining so white, because the word was out, don't go to Oregon.
Don't go to Oregon, yep. Okay, let's talk about the Chinese. That was the next group they started arriving in the 1850s to actually work in the gold mines and help build the train tracks and so on. And they left China to escape the wars there and natural disasters and poverty, and they'd send money back home to their families. It was primarily single males that came. Large numbers in 1861 to 63 ended up moving to both Eastern and Southern Oregon. That was when they were mining for gold. So in 1859, the Oregon Constitution, that same constitution that forbid African Americans from living here, also prohibited Chinese from owning real estate. It said no Chinaman, not a resident of the state, at the adoption of this constitution shall ever hold any real estate or work in any mining claim therein. And this was repealed finally in 1943. So they were the largest minority in Oregon by the 1880s. And again, they were here to build bridges and tunnels and railroads and so on. There were actually segregated Chinatowns throughout the state of Oregon. And in Portland, they lived in Southwest Portland and near Providence Park. And this is a picture down below. There was ongoing harassment. There was the theft of their gold, and they couldn't do anything about it, really. So in the 1880s, when the Depression came, the Chinese were blamed for bringing about the Depression, for causing all the problems. In 1882, the Chinese Exclusion Act was passed. And again, that was repealed in 1943. There was anti-Chinese violence up and down the entire West Coast, from California up to Washington. And the Chinese ended up moving away from southern and eastern Oregon, from the small towns in both those places, like in Jacksonville and so on. They ended up moving to Portland. They all moved there. There were fewer railroad jobs, and they were pushed out of mining. They got things stolen and so on, and there was violence from the white workers. So they were driven out of the areas surrounding Portland, like Mount Tabor, Albina, Gills Lake, and East Portland. So here's a sign that's in, I think this was come and deal with the 10th and 8th Streets. I think this was Ashland. Come to 10th and 8th Street at 7:30 Monday evening and express your opinion on the Chinese question. Shall we have Chinese? No, no, no. And this was 1892.
If I could just add one point, that Chinese Exclusion Act was the first time that our country had said you cannot enter our country if you are coming from a particular country. That had never happened, where our immigration was determined where you came from, that no more Chinese could come to the US.
Yeah, so they really targeted the Chinese on that. So this was an article in the Tribune in Chicago, 1891, and it had to do with, you know, it's from Pendleton. Report comes from Milton, a few miles from here. The Chinese were driven out of town last night by a mob. 100 men went to the Chinese quarters and led the Celestials out with ropes around their necks. It's thought that the mob consisted of discharged railroad section hands and their sympathizers in Milton. The Chinese were pretty roughly handled, and it is said 2 of them were badly beaten. So this was the Snake River Massacre. You might have heard of that in May of 1887. 7 men, and they were upstanding men in their community, and they ended up robbing, murdering, and mutilating 34 Chinese miners on the Snake River. 3 people were brought to trial. No one was ever convicted for this. And they call that area now Chinese Massacre Cove, and there's some plaques and signage there memorializing the 34 Chinese miners. Okay, in the new century, what we're seeing is tiny African-American populations growing around railroad stations. Many of them were working on the railroads as porters and so on, and they ended up settling near in Oregon around railroad stations. We also saw the only lynching that we know of that happened in Coos Bay in 1902. And it was a man that was supposedly, something happened with a white woman. He was, you know, put in jail, and then supposedly he escaped, and they was chased, and then he was lynched. So, and there is a plaque there to memorialize that today. This is when we saw the discrimination happening in public accommodations, such as restaurants and motels and so on. And sundown laws, we started seeing them come across the state, where if you were a person of color, you needed to be out of town by sundown. And it really was targeting the African Americans and the Chinese. And this is also where we saw the Realtor Code of Ethics and Restrictive Covenants come about. And it was national, their anti-immigration sentiment was national at this time. So
Can I add a quick point, if that's
Sure.
okay? On the Realtor Code of Ethics and Restrictive Covenants. So this was happening in the teens and into the 20s all over the country. And one typical example was the Portland Board of Realtors in 1919, where basically they added to their code of ethics that any realtor who sold a home in a white neighborhood to a person of color would be basically kicked out as a realtor, who would no longer be a realtor. And they defined a white neighborhood as 4 blocks solid of white neighborhood, and to preserve what they believed was the higher value. That's where that change in the code of ethics came. And the restrictive covenants became common both in individual properties and neighborhoods, where if you were not Caucasian, you could not buy the home, although you could live there as a domestic servant. And a lot of you are probably aware that today, when you look at the deeds of older homes, you may very much come across that language, which is no longer legally enforceable.
Right. And it wasn't just people of color, it was various religions as well. Jews and Catholics, it would be listed that you couldn't sell your home to a Catholic. You couldn't sell your home to a Jew. So it wasn't just your national origin or your color.
Yeah, there's one in the Mock Crest neighborhood of Portland where it listed out Indians, Filipinos, was a variety of things, but African Americans and Asians were pretty much always in the mix. But yes, then there would be additions, and certainly Jews.
We're on there too, yeah. So here's the actual American Institute of Real Estate Appraisers ranking, and you'll notice it's very, very white at the top, the English, the Germans, the Scotch, the Irish, and so on, all the way down to the least favorable, which are the Negroes and Mexicans. South Italians, because they're darker than North Italians, and some very interesting categories here. So, but this was the ranking that was in place from the 1920s through the 1940s. Let's talk a little about the Ku Klux Klan here in Oregon. They were a pretty large group. With this anti-immigration sentiment nationally, what we saw was the growth of the Klan nationwide. But we in Oregon had the largest Klan membership per capita in the 1920s. The picture on the top is, I think that's Ashland, and I think the picture on the bottom is Grants Pass. I can't remember, but yeah, I know that, is that right? Yeah, I usually use a different one. By 1922, we had 58 active Klaverns in Oregon. And we, at one point, I think it's 1923, there were 35,000 active members in the Klan. And that included groups of auxiliaries of women and children and so on. And there were a lot of prominent members. They were editors of newspapers and chiefs of police and mayors, and actually the governor at the time, Governor Pierce, was a prominent member. They were not, as you can imagine, who they were targeting would not necessarily be people of color, because there weren't very many in Oregon at the time, but they were very, very anti-Catholic. And we had only about 8% Catholic here in Oregon, and there was a fear that the Pope was going to take over and make all the decisions for us if people that were Catholic got into office and so on. We actually at that time passed a law that banned parochial schools. It was never implemented, but it was passed. The activities that were happening at the time with the Klan included the boycotts and the school's ballot measure, which I just talked about, the alien land law. Do you want to talk a little bit more about this, Diane, about the alien land law and various?
Yeah, there were, as Louise said, they tended to target on Catholics because there were like almost no African Americans in the state, very tiny. There were, however, Japanese people who had started to come here after the Chinese Exclusion Act, because then the employers were told, well, we can't bring any more Chinese workers. They started bringing Japanese workers, and some of them started purchasing farmland and doing well as farmers. So the Klan influenced the Oregon legislature to pass the alien land law, which basically said that these immigrants targeted at the Japanese could not purchase any farmland, could not purchase any property at all. There were ways around it. Many of them had friends who were not Japanese who purchased the homes in their names and so on. So many of them were still able to do that. The thing about the ballot measure that the Klan pushed, to close the Catholic schools, which was again passed, very successful, was actually overturned by the US Supreme Court 3 years later in 1925.
Nevada Standish, want to talk about that?
Sure. I don't know if there's anybody on the call here from Tillamook, but again, there were 58 clans and stories all over the state of Klan activity. And just to give you an idea of how that all worked, in Tillamook, there was a woman named Nevada Standish. This was in 1922. She was a white woman. She had refused to join the Klan Ladies Auxiliary. She may have been married to a Catholic. And one night at midnight, when she was sleeping, the Klan came into her home in their robes, and they burned a cross on her chest with a red hot poker. You can imagine how terrifying that was. She recognized the voice of the chief of police. Tillamook, like a lot of towns, the mayor, the chief of police, the superintendent of schools, the newspaper, all of them were controlled by the Klan. She bravely came forward to say what had happened. The newspaper, the Tillamook Headlight Herald, said she had burned the cross on her own chest for attention. So you can imagine her courage. So the statewide Klan leader met with her for, quote, some time. And then after the meeting, she said she realized she had been mistaken. So that gives you a sense of the power of the Klan, not only against people of color, Catholics, Jews, but others who might speak out against it.
Yeah, if you weren't part of the Klan, you weren't part of anything. I mean, it was really the big organization in Oregon. Oops, I missed that. I missed one, but I will. The Klan really had ended up just decreasing in popularity in the mid-20s after a series of issues with embezzlement and some other things, and the passage of the 1924 Immigration Act, which dramatically reduced immigration from both Southern and Eastern Europe. So there was a lot less to go after. There was a preference, of course, for British Isles, Germany. This is all immigration stuff that was happening in the 1920s, where there was a preference there for people from areas that were very, very white, and less so from where maybe there might be more people of color. There were no Asians, Africans, Arabs were allowed under this 1924 Immigration Act. And Calvin Coolidge, who was president, proclaimed America must remain American. And that was the whole philosophy at the time. So Diane, do you want to talk about that one area of the quote with the wall?
Yeah. I first of all, I was going to say, so originally, when the Klan started after the Civil War, it was to terrorize African Americans, to make sure they stayed on the plantations, they didn't vote, and so on. When the Klan started nationwide, the focus was immigrants, because there was the reaction because there had been about 14 million immigrants who had come to this country in the late 1800s, early 1900s. And there was this idea that they were going to take our jobs, change the culture, Catholics and Jews, foreign religions, the Pope, all of this. So the Klan's big effort was to pass this immigration law. And this was their big focus. And in fact, one of the reasons they shrunk is after they were successful in getting this law through Congress, they didn't really have another issue, that had really mobilize them to stop this influx of these people. And kind of an interesting quote, has certain relevance today perhaps, but from the 1924 Klan convention, the Klan leader said, quote, "I would build a wall of steel, a wall as high as heaven, against the admission of a single one of those Southern Europeans." Of course, you wonder about what a wall would look like when it was like the ocean. But anyway, so this was really their effort. And really, this was our core immigration law until there was real reform in the 1960s, where they said, well, we're not going to decide who we let into this country based on what country they're from. We're going to look at their employment skills, if they have family members or whatever. But this set the stage for decades.
Yeah, sounds like some of the things we hear today. So anyway, the picture on the top is from Roseburg. That was the joint KKK in Roseburg. So the corruption and scandals, the embezzlement, and at the very top of the leadership of the Klan really caused its downfall. Okay, then we had the impact of the Federal Housing Administration. This had a major impact on how we're set up today. It was an innovation during the Depression. It changed how home ownership and wealth creation happened. The Depression happened, and then before the FHA, you had to pay 50% down on your home, and you had 5 to 10 years to pay the balance. And then with the FHA, it's like today, 20% down, 30-year fixed rate mortgage. So this is where the beginning of that time, those terms started. But the federal underwriting standards, the FHA standards, they actually incorporated de facto racist standards in them. It was very clear that people owning homes were going to be white. So the redlining of neighborhoods that were predominantly communities of color, they led to extreme racial inequities in the FHA loans. So if there was an area that had a few people of color, then those areas would be redlined, even if there were just 1 or 2. as being an area that they didn't want to make loans in those areas. So this is the beginning of redlining. And between 1934 and 1962, of the $120 billion in loans that the FHA made, less than 2% went to non-whites, less than 2%. And then we had the war, Pearl Harbor, 1941. And Diane mentioned the Japanese had come into Oregon after the Chinese Exclusion Act. They came in to farm and they grew the majority of produce here in Oregon. There was a lot of resentment up toward them because they were very successful. They were very successful in terms of being farmers and so on. And then the 1923 Alien Land Law, which Diane also talked about, was there and kept them from going further. But there were 4,000 Japanese in Oregon at the time of the World War II. The largest community we saw here in Oregon was in Hood River, and they had about 4%. And also there was a Japantown right in Portland, in the city of Portland. So Executive Order 9066 came, and that instructed people of Japanese ancestry, didn't matter if they were citizens or not, and the greater majority were citizens, to pack a bag and convene in a certain area. And this was the beginning. The evacuation area went as far east as Highway 97. And they were put together. They went to the Portland Assembly Center, which was at the Expo, what we know as the Expo today. They were then sent from there. They lived in cattle pens and livestock pens there, where you'd have one family or two families per pen. And then they would move them out by train to various parts of the state or out into Idaho and other places into basically concentration camps. About 120,000 Japanese all over the US. And again, most of these were citizens, lost their homes and their farms during this time period. 2/3 were US citizens. So Tule Lake, this was the largest of the 10 war relocation incarceration camps. It was right on the border with Oregon, near Klamath. And it was where people were sent if they wouldn't swear allegiance to the United States government. They had to swear allegiance. And if they weren't a citizen, if they were like an older Japanese, where maybe they were still a Japanese citizen, they were afraid to swear allegiance to the US because they were afraid they wouldn't have any citizenship and they wouldn't have anything to say. So this was a really difficult thing. So you had a lot of seniors that ended up at these camps, and this camp in particular was pretty egregious in terms of they had those towers with people with guns. I mean, it was really a concentration camp. And at its peak, there were nearly 19,000 people that were housed there. The housing was terrible. The sanitation was bad, and the food and medical care was pretty much non-existent. I mean, they didn't really have enough to eat or anything. And the shacks, they lived in tar paper shacks, which got down to below, when it got down to below 0 in the winter and over 100. I don't know if any of you have been to Tule Lake, but it's pretty warm and there's not a lot of foliage, and it's over 100 in the summer. So meanwhile, also the POWs were sent to Tule Lake. More than 800 German and Italian POWs were brought in to do agricultural work, and they were white, and they earned higher wages than the Japanese Americans who were also there doing agricultural work. And after the war, in fact, during this time, their concentration camp, their camp was not the same as the one for the Japanese. The word was that it was very much nicer. They could come and go more as they pleased. They actually would go and have lunch with various people in the community and so on. And they had such a good experience there that many of them actually moved back to Tule Lake after the war. I mean, the local residents welcomed them back, not the Japanese, but the German and Italian POWs. Also at the time, a lot of Japanese, their children were fighting in the war. Were fighting against the German and the Italians. So this was really something else.
Let me just insert 1 second that the most decorated unit in World War II, the 42nd, was Japanese.
Yep.
Japanese Americans.
Okay, we're gonna shift over now to Diane. I'm gonna stop my share. She's gonna do hers, so.
Can you see it, Louise?
Yep.
Yay. Okay.
Good.
So, phew. So there was this sense in the country that the Japanese were this horrible threat, that they were spies, they were going to subvert our country. Even ones born in this country who knew nothing but the US were complete US citizens. So as Louise said, everywhere from Highway 97 west, they were forced into these concentration camps, whether it was Tule Lake or Minidoka in Idaho or Heart Mountain in Wyoming. But on the one hand, there was all this fear. On the other hand, there was an economic need for workers in Eastern Oregon, which was kind of interesting. So in Eastern Oregon, there was a huge effort to grow sugar beets, because sugar beets, the industrial alcohol that's processed from the sugar was used for explosives. And the expression was, every gunshot fired in the war takes a 1/4 acre of sugar beets. And the beets were also used to make rubber for the war. So they had lost a lot of their agricultural workers because they were fighting and so on. They desperately needed agricultural workers. So the Amalgamated Sugar Company got permission for Japanese Americans and Japanese who were in these camps to be able to leave and work in Eastern Oregon. And the interesting thing was they did, unlike the camps like Tule Lake and Minidoka, they were no longer living behind barbed wire. They didn't have armed guards. The housing wasn't great. They were in, living in tents or on farms. Or in old civilian conservation corps developments, but they lived pretty freely and they were able to go into town, into Nissa or possibly Ontario on the weekends to shop, go to movies and so on. So there was not one incident in Eastern Oregon or in Idaho where this was also taking place of any espionage, any problem. And gradually the curfews went down and the initial tensions of the residents were gone. However, a lot of the businesses did refuse to serve the Japanese. And as Louise said, a lot of them, they had children, fighting in the war and so on. So even with the Japanese, there was not enough agricultural workers. So the second group of agricultural workers coming into Eastern Oregon were braceros, contracted workers from Mexico. So 42 to 47, more than 15,000 men came to Oregon to do agricultural work. A lot of them were in Eastern Oregon, some were in Southern Oregon and some other places as well. This was the worst housing and living conditions of any of the groups doing the agricultural work. They lived in sort of like the tar paper places in Tule Lake. They bug houses that were not insulated, very hot in the summer, freezing in the winter. People got a lot of pneumonia, poor access to water in outhouses, very difficult situation. So in public accommodations in Nissan, Ontario, you would often see white trade only. So they didn't want the Japanese or the braceros coming into their businesses, their restaurants and their bars. And like Tule Lake, there were also German and Italian prisoners of war that were treated better than the townspeople, with the townspeople than the Japanese and the braceros. They were allowed to go to whatever business, restaurant, bar they wanted, even though we were at war with the countries they were from, because they were white and they looked similar to the other folks who were living there. So the similar dynamic wasn't limited to Ontario and Nissa. So another area of Eastern Oregon, Pendleton, during World War II, the triple, unfortunately you can't see this whole picture, but the triple nickels, the 555th paratroopers, very highly trained, like the Tuskegee Airmen, were stationed in Eastern Oregon where they were fighting Japanese balloon bombs. But no restaurant or bar would serve them, except the Chinese restaurant. And this was pretty typical with public accommodations, discrimination for decades in Oregon, that the only restaurants that would serve African Americans were the Chinese restaurants. And then in Southern Oregon, near Medford, there's the town White City. That was Camp White during the war, where there were white and African American servicemen. And the businesses in Medford and the surrounding area would not serve the African American servicemen. But guess what? The German and Italian POWs were served. So there was that same dynamic throughout the state.
Can I add something here? In White City, actually the commander of the camp ended up going to the businesses in Medford and said, we will not allow any of our soldiers to shop here unless you open up your stores to all of our soldiers. So I thought that was pretty interesting that they did that there.
So there was a massive increase of African Americans into Portland in World War II. Again, we had a very tiny population of African Americans, mostly folks who worked for the railroads until then, but there were all of these World War II jobs in the shipyards. Huge need for workers to come, and they came from all over the country. And so we had about 120,000 people come to Portland and to some degree Vancouver for these jobs, and about 20,000 of them were African Americans. So from 2,000 to an additional 20,000. So there was a headline in the Oregonian, September 23rd, 1942, new Negro migrants worry cities. Worry city. And signs went up in restaurants and places, white trade only, because these new people coming might not know the rules here. So where were all these African Americans going to live? Well, Portland did not have a housing authority. They didn't want one prior to World War II, but World War II, they kind of had to do it. And there was housing built, incredible amount of public housing built all over the metro area, more than 70,000 people. And in fact, you know, when we look at the need for affordable housing, where there's a will, there's a way. They needed to build affordable housing units. They built a ton of them. But out of all these developments throughout the metro area, there were only 2 where African Americans could live. And both of those developments were completely segregated. One was Vanport, which some of you may have heard of. If you go to the Portland International Raceway, Delta Park, there's a golf course there, Heron Lake Golf Course, I think. Anyway, that all was housing. Vanport was huge. It was the 2nd largest city at that time after Portland, and it was the largest public housing development in the state. The interesting thing about Vanport was, even though the housing was segregated, it was relatively integrated. The schools were integrated, the daycare, the movie theaters in Portland, African Americans sat in the balconies, just like the South. So it was a relatively integrated community. The only other development, public housing where African Americans could live, was in North Portland. People who know North Portland, where Montgomery Park building is, that was the Giles Lake development. That development was the 8th largest in the country. And the interesting thing there was, not only was the housing segregated, but the whites lived in houses and duplexes, the blacks lived in row houses and trailers, the whites had electric heat, and the African Americans had wood stoves. So it was, you know, the housing itself, unlike Vanport, was different. So at the end of the war, there were quite a few challenges, and one was certainly for the Japanese who were returning from those camps. So December 17, 1941, Federal Proclamation 21 ended the exclusion. People had small checks and they came back from Minidoka, from Tule Lake, and so on. And they did not get much of a welcome. So for example, Hood River, which had been such a large area where they lived, you can't see all of this, but it says, for your own interests, we urge you not to return to people, their former neighbors. And this was posted, it was in the newspapers, and so on. In Hood River, Japanese Americans lost title to 75% of the lands they had before the war. Nationally, the Federal Reserve Bank estimated that ethnic Japanese lost more than $400 million worth of property. So The Oregon legislature at this time passed a resolution saying we don't want these people to come back, and that alien land law that the Klan passed in the 20s was made even more restrictive. So now they said that Japanese Americans can't lease, live on, or work on other people's farmland. That was eventually overturned by the Oregon Supreme Court. It was very difficult for them to get mortgage loans, very difficult to get rentals, turned away. Housing became an impossible hurdle for people. Now, there were certainly some good folks who were out there who might have saved people's lands or rented to them. But in general, there was a real sentiment that they were not wanted. And signs again in businesses, pretty typical, no Japs allowed. I saw an interview with a man who came back from the war who'd been fighting in Europe. He had his uniform on. He went into a drugstore. They would not serve him a soda. And sometimes people found out, their homes or their lands were completely gone, like the Lake LaBiche area of Marion County, where Japanese farmers had grown celery and onions before the war. When they came back, their homes, everything had been burned to the ground, had been flattened. So the situation for African Americans after the war the big one was they no longer had jobs. All those shipyard jobs during the war went away. They were not admitted into unions. And so other folks weren't hiring them and wanted them to leave. So in 1945, the unemployment rate in Portland for whites was 8%. And for African Americans, it was 50%. The Red Cross would pay for one-way tickets for African Americans to leave Portland. And about half did. So in 1948, Vanport flooded, a massive flood. The city was destroyed. And there were still a lot of African Americans who lived there. When they left, where could they go? The redlined area, the Albina, Northeast Portland area, was the area for African Americans. So they crowded into Northeast Portland because that was the one place they could go. And the population density there was 6 times higher than anywhere else in the city.
One thing about Vanport too is one of the only places, and I'll cue this up as I talk. Oh, you got to close yours first, I guess, Diane.
Okay, will I be able to get it back again?
Yeah.
Oh, no, I had to close it. I thought you were going to go on top of that.
I tried.
Okay, we'll see if we can bring it back up. Hopefully we can. I don't know.
Oops, I didn't want to do that. Shoot.
We're going to a video clip. That's what's happening here.
We're going to a video clip. If I can figure out how I can do that. Shoot. Share screen. Got it optimized.
It's still there.
Here we go. But a lot of the Japanese ended up in Vanport. It was one of the only places they could go.
Louise, do you want to share your screen? I don't think we're able to see it.
Hold on.
So
No.
while Louise is working on that, I'm going to add a point to what she just said. So when the Vanport flood happened and those Japanese lost everything they had, this is the second time that happened to them. First, when they were forced to leave their homes to go to the camps, they could only carry so many things. And then after the Vanport flood, they had nothing, usually like a suitcase of what they were able to pack at the last minute.
For some reason, let's see, share the screen. Now I did this before. It's not working. It's not working this time. Let's see.
If you hit share screen.
Oops, here.
And then screen 1 or
share screen. And here.
Perfect.
No, it's not perfect because I can't get to the video for some reason.
Go ahead and exit out of that.
Okay. Okay. Your screen sharing is paused.
Oh,
So,
Yay.
you see it?
It was a time when hundreds of thousands of GIs came home ready to start families, but had no place to live.
The living space was at a premium. When in the Bronx, they tried building Quonset huts, and they turned to slums. All the Quonset huts had just disintegrated. There were two families sharing a hut. One family at one end, one family at the other, and before you know it, they were awful.
FHA came to the rescue by insuring long-term, low monthly payment mortgage loans.
Veterans needed homes for families. They turned to a revolutionary New Deal housing program. It would racialize housing, wealth, and opportunity for decades in ways few could have imagined.
In the 1930s, the federal government created the Federal Housing Administration, whose job it was to provide loans or the backing for loans to average Americans so they could purchase a home.
Due to the stimulation of the National Housing Act, from every section of the country come reports of vastly
In order to purchase a house in America prior to 1930s, you had to pay 50% of the sales price up front. The new terms of purchasing a home was that you put 10% or 20% down, and the bank financed 80% of it, not over 5 years, but over 30 years at relatively low rates. This opened up the opportunities for Americans to own homes like ever before. The average person could own that home.
If these terms sound familiar, they should, because this is essentially the same financing scheme that allows most Americans to own their homes today. Federal programs and banks sank millions into the home construction industry. Their message to veterans: you can afford a new home. Buy a new home now. On the outskirts of Baltimore, Memphis, Chicago, Los Angeles, Denver, and other cities, brand new communities sprang up. One of the most famous was a Long Island potato field, transformed into 17,000 new homes. It was called Levittown. Tax dollars helped make the single-family home a mass-produced consumer item. The American dream had a new name: suburbia.
You have to remember the people who came here in 1947, 1948 were young ex-GIs whose uppermost concern was taking advantage of the GI Bill and making things better for themselves.
Before moving to Levittown, Herb Callisman and his wife Doris lived in a cramped attic apartment in New York City.
And when we began to look for an apartment, we found that the apartments were $100, $125, $150 a month. I know that's unbelievable today, but it was too expensive for us. And out here in Levittown, the mortgage payments was $65 a month.
Your kitchen dazzles every eye. A brand new sink, a built-in oven, a new refrigerator, and
If you were buying a Levitt home in 1947, 48, 49, 50, and 51, you would get, this would be your kitchen. You would get a GE stove, GE refrigerator, and a Bendix wash machine. It would be part of the real estate.
We came to Levittown and we found the model house, and we walked in and we looked around, and of course, in the eyes of a young man who was raised in the ghetto, so to speak, It was an interesting experience, interesting lifestyle, seeing all the new modern conveniences. Very fascinating.
Eugene Burnett came home with almost 1 million other black GIs. They had fought for the country in segregated ranks. They returned hoping for equality and the American dream. For many, that dream was a new home for little money down and some of the easiest credit terms in history.
I went up to the salesman. We're interested in your home. We're interested in buying one. And what is the procedure? Is there an application to be filled out? So forth. So he looked at me, looked around, and he said to me, he says, listen, it's not me, but the owners of this development have not as yet decided to sell these homes to Negroes.
It was as though it wasn't real. You can't imagine. But for someone to come out and actually tell you that they can't sell to you. You know, I was really on an up. Man, look at this house. Can you imagine having this? And then for them to tell me because of the color of my skin, I can't be a part of it.
The FHA underwriters warned that the presence of even 1 or 2 non-white families could undermine real estate values in the new suburbs. These government guidelines were widely adopted by private industry. Race had long played a role in local real estate practices. Starting in the 1930s, government officials institutionalized a national appraisal system where race was as much a factor in real estate assessment as the condition of the property. Using this scheme, federal investigators evaluated 239 cities across the country for financial risk.
So that those communities that were all white, suburban, and far away from minority areas, they received the highest rating, and that was the color green. Those communities that were all minority or in the process of changing, they got the lowest rating, and the color red. They were redlined. As a consequence, most of the mortgages went to suburbanizing America, and it suburbanized it racially.
The racial logic adopts the principle that an integrated neighborhood is a bad risk, is a financial risk, that an integrated neighborhood is likely to be an unstable neighborhood, unstable socially, but therefore also unstable economically.
When the white residents of 8 Mile Road in Detroit were told they were too close to a black neighborhood to qualify for a positive FHA rating, they built this 6-foot wall between themselves and their black neighbors. Once the wall went up, mortgages on the white properties were approved. Between 1934 and 1962, the federal government underwrote $120 billion in new housing. Less than 2% went to non-whites.
I can understand an individual, depending on his environment or his family or whatever, being racist, but for your country to sanction it, give him tools to do that, there's something deadly wrong there.
I think we had the golden chance after World War II, and we flubbed it, because here we had a GI Bill that was that was available to everybody, but in a way they didn't make it available to everybody, and that was a golden opportunity in this country, and we missed it. We really missed it.
You can always tell, can't you? A town with good real estate people is a more substantial community because more people own their own homes. That's right.
And now it's sort of hard to believe that the federal government nationalized and introduced redlining. In a funny way, it wasn't just giving something to whites, it was constructing whiteness. Whiteness meant, as in the past, whites had meant being a citizen and being a Christian. It now meant living in the suburbs.
Only 50 years before, European ethnics were believed to be distinct races. Now, in these new segregated neighborhoods, they blended together as white Americans.
We did have different religious groups. We were mixed up there, but we were an all-white community, and I think it's an unrealistic world. I think there's something sterile about everyone being on the same economic level and everyone being the same color.
It certainly doesn't promote a feeling of a wider world, wider, not whiter, to live in a place where there are only people that look like you.
Cartoonist Bill Griffith remembers moving from Brooklyn to Levittown as a kid.
It's an untenable artificial world. You're creating a weird utopia in a way, a utopia of middle-class white people who were trying to deny that they were living in a multi-racial world. And how long can you keep that up? You can't keep that up forever. Whether there were going to be black people in Levittown was just, it would be almost the equivalent of saying, are there going to be Martians in Levittown?
Here you go. Now you can start again.
Okay. All right, just one moment, folks.
Didn't start where it stopped, huh?
No, it didn't.
There, next 28, yeah.
All right, well, thanks for your patience. So there were some beginnings of positive change starting in the late 1940s with the Supreme Court case Shelley versus Kramer. Now, back in 1926, the case Corrigan versus Buckley said those restrictive covenants where it said Caucasians only can live in this home, that was fine. That was overturned in 1948. That was really the first big civil rights case, and argued by Thurgood Marshall and the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. In 1953, Oregon passed a public accommodations law. And then in 1959, a state fair housing law. Unfortunately, neither of these laws had real teeth with enforcement, but they were definitely steps forward. And for those of you who've lived in Oregon long enough to know the name Mark Hatfield, who was senator and before that governor, he was very active. He had been active in civil rights all the way through, and he was really, really strong in pushing for these laws. So that was a good first step, but it takes quite a while for behaviors to change. And again, these laws really didn't have any enforcement or much enforcement attached to them. So there was still segregation. There was still steering among realtors. Realtor groups at the time spoke in terms of forced housing, the idea that the government would interfere with their work. There were still sundown laws where African Americans, Asians could not be in town after dark, not necessarily always on the books. And those continued into the 1960s. I talked to a gentleman in Pendleton who was involved with changing that. And I've also heard stories that in Cottage Grove and Cave Junction, those sundown laws may have still been around into the 1970s. Even though those laws had passed, discrimination in public accommodations and employment continued. Some of you may have seen the movie, I think it was 2 years ago, I would guess, Green Book. where they showed the Green Book that showed where African Americans could stay because so many places, hotels, motels were off limits. Well, Green Book wasn't only in the South, it was all over the country, including Oregon. So you'd have to, if you were African American coming here, you'd have to look in the Green Book to see which hotels, and there were very few of them, that you would be allowed to stay in. And employment discrimination continued as well. This is fairly typical. All white help. They were only hiring for white employees at this restaurant, the Paris Cafe in Ashland. Louise, would you like to?
Sure. So, you know, when the Harlem Globetrotters would come to town to entertain in Medford or primarily in Grants Pass, where there were still sundown laws in the 50s and 60s, they would have to leave before sundown and stay somewhere else. And usually what would happen is they would travel to the Umpqua Hotel in Roseburg, which was one of the only public accommodations that would welcome people of color. It was owned by a Jewish man, and he other than Portland, it was one of the only places in the state of Oregon where people of color could stay. So the Harlem Globetrotters often had to leave town. And then when Medford opened up, they had some places that would accommodate people of color. It took Grants Pass a long time to be in that same boat where what would happen is people the Globetrotters would play there, and then they would have to go stay in Medford. They'd have to leave town. So this was quite common even up until the late 60s.
So in the 1950s, 60s, and into the 70s, all around the country, urban renewal projects became big deals where, big, public buildings and so on going into neighborhoods, usually historically neighborhoods of color. And in fact, the author James Baldwin referred to urban renewal as Negro removal. And so Portland was a good example of that. So historically, Albina was the area that had been designated going back to the teens and 20s as the area for African Americans. And this was where urban renewal and dislocations really occurred. The first one being the Memorial Coliseum in the 50s. When that went in, a lot of folks lost their housing, predominantly African Americans. And then a reroute of the Interstate 5 freeway, that was the second time. And then Emmanuel Hospital had a plan to expand the hospital, which never ultimately occurred, but they thought it was going to. And so this was the third time that people in that area of Northeast Portland lost their homes, had them demolished. And by this point, there were a lot of protests. There were a lot of very angry people about the dislocations of the community. In the case of Emmanuel, the city and the Portland Development Commission had been planning this for 10 years. The neighbors didn't find out about it until they got the notice it was going to happen. And again, the federal funds never came through to expand the hospital. So a lot of people lost their homes and there was nothing there. So these urban renewal projects, there was the loss of about 1,000 homes, businesses. Picture on the top was a very prominent business, the Hill Block building in Northeast Portland, a real center in the African American community that was destroyed, and a real loss of community. The other picture is one of the protests against the Emmanuel expansion. There was another urban renewal effort that also dislocated a lot of folks in South Portland. If people are familiar with the Keller Auditorium in Portland, the South Auditorium project dislocated a large immigrant community, primarily Jewish immigrants, also Italian immigrants. There used to be in this area kosher butchers, Yiddish theater, all of these things that was destroyed by that project. 500 buildings, 1,500 people relocated, really 54 blocks of housing were destroyed. So those were huge dislocations on these communities.
Something else about urban renewal. It wasn't just happening in Portland. It happened, of course, all over cities all over, well, the country, but in Oregon, what was going on, especially the I-5 reroute, that would often divide neighborhoods. And in this case, although we didn't have a lot of people of color, we can use income as a proxy for race in some cases. So you'd have lower income on one side of the freeway and more middle and higher on the other. So the same kind of segregation was happening, but it was more income based, and it was happening throughout. And urban renewal was instrumental in transportation improvements were instrumental in making that kind of segregation happen.
So, yay. So we have the civil rights movement coming into play in the 1960s. 1964 Civil Rights Act, Voting Rights Act in 65, and then in 1968, the passage of the Federal Fair Housing Act. This was the most difficult civil rights bill to get through Congress. The Mail ran 150 to 1 against the Fair Housing Act. There was the idea that it was governmental interference in private transactions. And there was a terrible fear that an integrated neighborhood would bring down property values. And that goes all the way back to 1919. And when they first started looking at these things, those appraisal lists and so on, the idea that once African Americans or other people of color moved into the neighborhood, people's properties values would go down, and people were deathly afraid of that. So it was extremely difficult to move this bill through Congress. It finally passed April 11th, a week after Dr. King's death. And it made it illegal to discriminate in housing based on race, color, religion, or national origin. And originally, the intent of the bill was not only to look at individual acts of discrimination, but also systemic segregation. And we're going to take a look at the process of what finally passed that bill with another video clip.
Okay, so bear with me while I try again. Oh, you gotta stop yours. Did you stop yours, Diane? Oh, here we go. Okay, so let me get mine up here. Oops.
Few in the nation believed that fair housing would in our time become the unchallenged law of this land. And indeed, this bill has had a long and stormy trip.
Well, I don't know what will happen now. We've got some difficult days ahead. Like anybody, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place. But I'm not concerned about that now. And I've looked over and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land. So I'm happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man.
Ladies and gentlemen, Martin Luther King was shot and was killed tonight in Memphis.
The death of the prophet of nonviolence set off the worst outbreak of arson, looting, and criminal activity in the nation's history. Washington's ghettos burned within a few blocks of the nation's capital.
The life of a man who symbolized the freedom and faith of America has been taken. And no words of mine can fill the void of the eloquent voice that has been stilled. But this I do believe deeply, that the dream of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. has not died with him.
President Johnson was willing to speak up and say, we have to pass a fair housing bill.
Hello, Mr. President? Yes, Dick. We're in trouble. We need some help. Yes? I'm afraid of that.
Federal troops, for the first time since the Civil War, took up positions to guard government buildings.
Nothing's probably touchier than your own neighborhood and your own home or your own apartment. The administration, which supported the bill, said this has no chance. The other stuff is okay, but this will kill any politician that touches it.
Well, I just could not live beside them. I don't feel that they should be oppressed, but I moved here because it was a white community.
I have 2 daughters and 2 sons, and if there's too many colored people around here, I definitely will get out.
I think that, well, the property values will immediately go down if they are allowed to move in here in any number.
It seems as though our country is pulling apart into separate societies, where whites have jobs and Negroes have unemployment, where the middle class lives in suburbs and the poor are left in the ghettos, where one group of Americans looks upon another group of Americans with growing mistrust and even dread.
Then the bill went over into the House Rules Committee, and under the chairmanship of the famous Judge Smith, a right-wing segregationist from Virginia, he wouldn't hold hearings on it. He would take the bill home so nobody could act on it, and we were running out of time.
Thousands flowed through the rainy streets of Memphis this day, finishing a march that Dr. King planned to lead in support of striking garbage workers.
How many men must die before we can really have a free and true and peaceful society?
Of your presence, Lord. And I know you'll reach out and take mine. You take our hand.
The death of Martin Luther King is a tragic thing, but no legislation should be passed as a memorial to anyone.
In spite of the riots, I am going to support this legislation with all the vigor that I possess.
The laws that we pass up here are for all time. The Martin Luther Kings come and go.
The public reaction to this horror gave the sensible members of the committee a compelling argument that the House Rules Committee had to report that bill out. And I think that's how we got our bill. They just didn't dare bottle it up any longer.
And I have a dream that one day Negroes will be able to buy a house anywhere that their money will carry them.
At long last this afternoon, fair housing for all is now a part of the American way of life. Democracy's work is being done, and the bell of freedom rings out a little louder. We have come some of the way, not near all of it.
Fight still goes on.
Okay.
One moment, please. Almost there.
There it is.
Okay, thank you for your patience again, everyone. So today, under federal law, again, race, color, national origin or ethnicity, religion, illegal to discriminate in any of these categories. And that was from the 1968 law. In the 1970s, we had the women's movement. It became illegal to discriminate based on gender. A lot of times you'll talk to women or single moms who say that they couldn't get a landlord to rent to them because of their gender, potentially even assuming they couldn't do the yard work or anything like that. And then the second big federal law in 1988 added additional protected classes, families with children and disabilities. So families with kids before 1988, almost 70% of rentals were no children allowed. And some of you may remember that. I remember when I first moved to Portland in the late 70s that there used to be apartment complexes that were only for single adults under 30, you know, because I was one of them then. So yeah, so that's how it was. And people were deathly afraid that a landlord might find out they were pregnant and evict them. The second protected class added in the 1988 law was disabilities, people with disabilities. And this was huge. This came out of a social movement, the independent living movement, which were people with disabilities fighting to be able to live independently in housing, and also fighting for the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act. And what this meant is a lot of folks who had been living with family members, living in more institutional settings, could then live independently. And one of the things in there was requiring multifamily housing to meet certain basic accessibility requirements. And then the other important aspect of the 1988 federal law was it finally had teeth. Because before 1988, you couldn't get attorney's fees, damages were very limited. Before 1988, organizations like ours did not have the ability to do testing, to use secret shoppers to see if discrimination was happening. That all changed in 1988. So really fair housing got to be quite a bit stronger. And then the state of Oregon added additional protected classes. It's illegal in Oregon to discriminate based on marital status, source of income. You know, someone, for example, who has a Section 8 voucher or public assistance can't be told that they can't rent a unit. Sexual orientation, gender identity. And there are also local ordinances in some cities and counties that add additional protections, such as no discrimination based on occupation or based on age. So the other way that fair housing protections can expand is through administrative rulings. For example, there were 2 HUD rulings in 2016. One had to do with harassment. You know, it's always been illegal for housing providers to harass people based on protected class, but now housing providers had a responsibility. So a landlord that has a tenant in unit A harassing a tenant in unit B because of their race or sexual orientation or whatever would need to take action. And then also in 2016, there was guidance that came out on criminal history. So a landlord who says, I'm not renting to anyone with any criminal history or any felon without looking into what the crime was, how long ago, what's happened since then, that's no longer okay. So that didn't happen through Congress, you know, that happened through administrative rulings. And then fair housing protections continue to evolve through the courts. And one example of how this works was a case back in 2001 that was on the Oregon coast. There was a woman named Tiffany Alvera, and she had been a victim of domestic violence. And she got a restraining order against her husband. He was out of there and he left. He actually left the country. She shared that restraining order with her landlord to say, see, this is what's going on. This guy can't be here. Then the landlord gave her a 24-hour notice, a 24-hour eviction notice that says you or someone under control has done this horrible thing. Well, that certainly is incredibly unfair. So that went into the court system, and it was determined that discriminating against domestic violence victims, survivors, has a disparate impact, a larger impact based on gender, because so many DV victims, certainly not all of them, but a lot of them are women. And so it fell under the Fair Housing Act under sex discrimination. And then it became clear that you can't discriminate against people because they've suffered from domestic violence. Since then, there's now the Violence Against Women's Act and Oregon state law that have institutionalized it, but it started out through a court case. And so that's a way that the protections continue to evolve. So where we are in the Fair Housing Council of Oregon, we deal with discrimination in rentals, sales, and loans. The vast majority of the problems we do see are in rentals. We also see an increasing number of problems in homeowner associations that don't realize they have legal responsibilities. A lot of the discrimination we see is not real overt, although we still get the no kids allowed thing. But it does tend to be pervasive, even though it's not as overt. So for example, someone who says to a rental applicant, you know, the unit has been rented when it really hasn't, because that applicant is, you know, a person of color or a gay couple or whatever. And that's where our secret shoppers, our testers, can help us uncover discrimination. A lot of issues around disabilities in housing, people who might need different accommodations, primarily dealing with landlords because of their disabilities. Unfortunately, there is an increase in harassment in general in this country, but about a third of acts of harassment happen in housing, according to the Southern Poverty Law Center. So again, landlords need to do something when one of their tenants is harassing another because they're protected class. We also look at different, more systemic issues that are happening beyond individual acts of discrimination. And one of the things we've been really looking at in Portland is the impact of gentrification. So here's that same neighborhood, Northeast Portland, Albina, that was originally designated for African Americans and redlined. So massive changes in that area, and that's after the urban renewal dislocation. So in 1990, more than 75% of African Americans lived in Northeast Portland, and today it's below 25%. And in the new census, we might find out that's even lower because new people have moved into that area. And what that's meant, as new people, predominantly white, relatively affluent, have moved in, it's changed a lot of things. People cannot afford, who lived there historically, to stay there. The property taxes went up, rents skyrocketed, conversion of rentals to condos, and so on. And actually, Generations Governing Magazine, has identified Portland as the most gentrified city in the country, which is saying a lot because gentrification is happening everywhere. I mean, even in Harlem, New York, over 50% of people in Harlem are white. I mean, that's pretty incredible when you think about it. But Portland is way up there. And if you go to into Northeast Portland, you're looking at Williams, Russell, that area that used to be all vibrant African-American businesses. There's only a couple that have left. In fact, every time I go into that neighborhood, I don't recognize it more and more. And a lot of these folks have moved east, East Multnomah County, East Portland, which now is really high ratio of people of color. It's a real major dislocation. And it's meant a real loss of community, churches, schools. I talked to a group of teachers at Boise Elliott Humboldt Elementary School in Northeast Portland. Schools have been there forever. And they said, you know, we have parents driving their kids into school, like from way far east, so their kids can go to the school that their parents and grandparents went to in the old community. So that kind of gives you a sense of that loss of community and how to address that, which is something that the city of Portland and a variety of players is attempting to see, can anything be done about this? So all of this history, as Luis said in the beginning, there's still a lot of these ghosts that are with us. And there's a couple of quotes that I think are really relevant. One is William Faulkner, "The past isn't dead, it isn't even past. And the other one, George Santayana, those who can't remember the past are doomed to repeat it. So there's this history of discrimination, segregation, displacement, intimidation going all the way back. So why is Oregon such a white state? It goes all the way back to those first exclusion laws that predated us even being a state. Why do people live where they do? Well, there's a lot of reasons, but let's say somebody who comes to Portland, Multnomah County and says, gee, all the African Americans seem to live on the east side. Well, that's because of a whole lot of history that happened there. Why is it that people of color have less wealth? Well, one of the big reasons goes back to those FHA loans. All these folks who got loans, FHA, were able to get equity have equity to pass on to their children and grandchildren, and equity is a major source of wealth. And again, folks who were unable to purchase homes did not have that access to equity. History repeats itself. This idea of blaming people who are minorities in bad economic times for whatever is going on. Immigrants, foreign religions. Yeah, the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, the Alien Land Law of 1923, the Immigration Act of 1924. There were in the 30s and 50s times where they rounded up Mexicans and Mexican American citizens and forcibly deported them. So there's a lot going on today that you might think of in terms of Muslim bans or treatments of immigrants or whatever, where this sounds fairly similar. And also right now, we hear at our office a lot of harassment against Asians who are accused of having caused the COVID virus. So, there's this blame mentality. So what can we do? Well, that's certainly something to dialogue about, but I can say one thing just about standing up for our neighbors, because we don't know who is going to be the target next, so to speak. And a couple of stories that I find really inspiring. One is Lake LaBiche, that area of Marion County that had been Japanese farmers of celery and onions until they were forced to the camps. On December 7th, after Pearl Harbor, the minister at a Japanese Methodist church there got a call saying the American Legion is coming to burn down your church. You can imagine how terrified he was. He got on the phone and managed to get other pastors from Salem to come out, stand arm in arm with him, so that when these folks showed up at the church with their torches and their weapons or whatever, the pastors as a whole were able to talk them down. The Japanese American Citizens League has always said, we know what happened to us. We don't want it to happen to other people. After 9/11, when there was talk about rounding up Arab Americans and putting them in camps, it was the JACL who came forward. And again, recently, last year, there was a plan to take children who were taken from their parents in this whole immigration thing and put them into this place, Fort Sill, Oklahoma. The Japanese American Citizens League said this is where we were imprisoned in World War II. It was actually where Native Americans had been imprisoned in the 19th century. Geronimo is buried there, and they said this can't go on. And they organized massive demonstrations, and then the government decided not to put the children into Fort Sill. So let's see here. I am going to want to make sure we have a little bit of time at least for some questions. This is just our number. And if you have, a fair housing issue today, you have a question, about steering or advertising or anything else. Our organization does not only serve tenants, we serve landlords, realtors, whoever, and just call us and press extension 5 or email us at information@fhco.org. And we'd be glad to hear what your issue is. And I'm going to stop sharing this and see if anyone has any questions or comments or anything that anyone wants to share.
Thank you so much, Louise and Diane. This was phenomenal. I've already gotten some emails and messages from folks saying how really informative this was and how much they appreciate it.
Good.
I think this is a really important history to Oregon that is really, it impacts what we do every day as realtors. And it's incredibly important to understand this history and understand how
we got where we are.
how we got where we are.
We
Exactly.
actually would love feedback from folks. Did you send her the survey link, Louise?
No, I can do that.
You do that. Yeah. We'd love people to just respond and let us know how this was for you. By the way.
Absolutely. I'm happy to share. I'll share that out to the whole membership afterwards.
Thank
Absolutely. Thank you.
I'll give that to you then.
All right.
Yeah. So there's some stuff in the chat. Is there anything that we need to?
No, one comment says I learned more in this than in my American History BA program, which is pretty impressive.
One thing that I would recommend, if you haven't read it, it's called The Color of Law by Richard Rothstein. It's an excellent book and very well written, very easy to read, and well, difficult in terms of emotion involved, but it talks about how our neighborhoods became the way they were, that we once had neighborhoods that were a lot more integrated in many communities, and the government with its FHA and everything else ended up making them more segregated and more like they are today. And so it's a very, very interesting book, and really for realtors, I would think it'd be really a good one to read.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. And Summer, thank you for your comment. If you would send me an email with that comment, that would be really helpful. So thank you. Thank you, Summer. Well, I want to thank you both so much. I see the time, so I will, we can end this now, but thank you both so much again. I hope to be calling on you again in the future for doing something similar, because I think this is, again, an incredibly important topic. And I really want to thank our attendees. I know that the Tuesday after holiday weekend during some apocalyptic style air quality, and
it's like people lost power. Some people lost power.
Yeah, some people were logging in and out.
Fortunately, we didn't.
Yes,
right.
Absolutely.
Worried about that.
Yeah.
Yes. So again, thank you all for making time to join us today. We really appreciate it. Thank you, Louise and Diane, for giving this informative class. This is incredibly helpful, and we look forward to OAR will be doing in our diversity and fair housing series. We'll be talking about trans rights, and so I will be sending that out, and trans inclusive real estate and business practices for your office as well. So we will be getting that scheduled and sending out information on that here shortly. So thank you again, and with that, we'll go ahead and end the meeting.
Thank you, Erica.
Yes, thank you.